So welcome everybody, and tonight we're going to be talking about the wildflowers, indeed the wildlife as well, and the ecology of summer meadows. And this is a kind of an introduction to the field meeting that will take place on Saturday at Brox Hill. So I just wanted to say as an introduction, a thank you to the City Council and their Saving the Saffron Brook project, which is sponsoring this whole series of events. And just as a quick introduction, this is a kind of partnership that involves quite a wide range of organisations, and it's about looking at the whole Saffron Brook catchment area. The Saffron Brook, which you may know as the Wash Brook, runs from Oadby through Knighton into Ayleston and eventually connects up with the River Soar in Ayleston. And the project is all about trying to improve wildlife habitats within that whole area, but also to do quite a lot of education and engagement work to try and help people to become more aware and learn more about the wildlife in that area and obviously in Leicestershire as a whole. And also linked with this, we are encouraging anybody that's got an interest to have a go at the 100 Species Challenge on Nature Spot. I know some of you have already signed up to do it. It's free to engage. You can just get an account online and then just email Nature Spot to say you want to do it, and we'll sign you up. And then you get a range of resources and you get invited to all of these events. And hopefully it's a way of kind of helping you to learn a little bit more about the wildlife in the area. Just as a general pointer, on the Nature Spot website, we have a whole series of Leicestershire wildlife guides, which are free to download. On the top menu on the home page, if you look under ID Help, it's the top item there. They cover a whole wide range of different species, and they're designed to give you a quick introduction to different wildlife groups and to point out the species that are you're most readily going to come across and they're most easily identified. Obviously there are many more to see, but it's a good start if you're not familiar with any of those groups. So just while we're thinking about wildflower meadows, in terms of the wildflowers and indeed the grasses that make up there, I just thought I'd highlight these books, which I think are some of the best ones around. As a general wildflower guide, the Collins book is really good value because it covers trees and grasses and sedges. It covers the whole array of vascular plants. But if you really want to learn grasses and their related sedges and rushes, then the two documents on the right give you a little bit more help. The one on the far right is actually out of print at the moment, but if you can get a hold of a copy, I'd recommend it because it's just featuring the grasses we find in this area. So it makes it a lot easier. You don't have to plow through all of the kind of coastal plants, for example, that we don't get. If you don't want to buy a book, then I'd certainly recommend you use the Nature Spot galleries. The advantage with those is that they only feature the species that are being found in Leicestershire and Rutland. So a bit like the East Midlands guide, it narrows down the field, just makes it easier to find to find a match for whatever you've seen. And then another, I think, quite useful website, which I found useful, is the Wildflower Finder. It gives really good detailed pictures of all the key features for most of the plants. You need to really know the plant that you've got in order to narrow it down and look at those features. But if you think you've found it, it's worth having a look there to see if it matches. And then perhaps lastly, I would recommend a hand lens. They're not expensive and they make so much difference to allowing you to see the detail that is often crucial for identifying things, like the hairs on the stems and that kind of thing. So let's give a little bit of thought to meadows. Most people, I think, tend to assume that meadows are just a load of flowers. And when they think of wildlife on meadows, they think particularly of the insects, the bees, the butterflies particularly, that visit those flowers, you know, the pollinators, if you like. They're the insects that are visiting the flowers to feed on the nectar and indirectly picking up the pollen, and from the plant's point of view, hopefully transferring it to another in that species. But from an ecological point of view, meadows are much, much more than just a bunch of flowers. It's really the whole structure of the meadow that is providing a three-dimensional habitat. So yes, they provide a nectar source when the flowers come into bloom. But for many insects, they don't feed on nectar. They're vegetarian. They feed on the leaves, and so the leaves of the plants and the leaves of the grasses are more important, really, in terms of the vast majority of wildlife. But beyond the food, the meadows are providing kind of shelter, and particularly cover to protect them from predators. If you compare a meadow that's been allowed to grow, it's maybe half a meter high, compared to mown grass, then one of the critical differences is not just the physical cover, but also the moisture level that you get, particularly down at root level, at the base of those plants. Most invertebrates need moisture to survive. So in the kind of baked desert of a mown grass environment, they just can't live there. Whereas once the grass grows, then the base layer doesn't dry out anywhere near to that degree. And if you kind of stick your head right down at the base of a taller grass, you'll see it's heaving with all sorts of tiny little creatures, springtails and the like. And they're all forming the basis of the food chain. Without those, we wouldn't have the higher level predators. And then obviously from a sustainable kind of ecological point of view, it's important that the species have got somewhere to breed in order to create the next generation. So that whole structure is providing that huge array of different microhabitats. And we should also consider the soil, not just the vegetation above it. Many creatures, again, relying on the damp particularly, will live within the soil. So when we think about a meadow, I think most people have this kind of idea that it's looks a bit like a chocolate box, you know, very colourful. The kind of plants that you will see if you Google a wildflower meadow are the kind of things you'll see here. You know, poppies, corn marigolds, cornflowers, corn cockles, and the like. And these are certainly very colourful, but they are all annual plants. They're actually cornfield annuals, which are now very rare in the wild. And the trouble with meadows or grassland that are sown with these kind of seeds is it's a very short-lived affair. You'll get the colour for just 2 or 3 weeks in the summer, and then the rest of the year there'll be nothing much there. And unless you sow perennial plants as well, then basically you're back to square one and you have to start all over again. And they're not very good for wildlife. They don't have any grasses in them. They don't have much structure. They're too open. And and we'll talk a little bit about meadow creation in a short while. We don't recommend creating this kind of meadow. So, I mean, what is a meadow? I mean, there are all sorts of kind of wildflower meadows. I think possibly kind of a hay meadow. It is the one that most people think of, but it's really any kind of permanent grassland where wildflowers can grow mixed in with the grassland. And so I think it's worth looking a little bit more at some of the factors that control these meadows, because that's ultimately what's going to, you know, provide the habitat for a whole array of wildlife that lives in the meadow. So just to emphasize, you know, the meadow's not just a bunch of annuals. So actually, just to conclude on what a meadow might look like, this is more of a real meadow. Obviously, it's not a hay meadow as such, and no doubt it's been sown from seed, but it's sown with perennials. And I think the first thing you'll notice is that there's more grass than flowers, and that's as it should be. Typically, a sustainable permanent meadow will be about 80% grass. not just one grass species, it should have a whole range of different grass species. But it should look a little bit like this. So before we get stuck into the wildlife, let's think about some of the factors that determine the type of meadow that we're going to get. And one of probably the most crucial factor is the level of soil nutrients, particularly nitrogen that's in the soil. This completely determines the type of grassland and wildflowers that you get there. And unfortunately, most soils now are high in nutrients. And so this kind of fairly untidy, rough-looking grassland area is what you often see, particularly on verges and the like. And when you have high nutrients, what you then get is you get grassland that's dominated by grasses, and particularly the larger grasses that can kind of take over. Grasses can respond to nutrients more quickly than wildflowers do, so they just simply grow more quickly. And those large grasses that need lots of nitrogen in order to kind of create the bulk, they're the ones that can really thrive and take over. You'll also get a few larger wildflowers in there, cow parsley, docks, nettles, and in this picture here, that purple one is spear thistle. But we're not getting the array of the more colourful wildflowers and the diversity of species that we would like. So contrast that with low nutrient soil, then the low nutrients limits the overall growth, and as a consequence, you get less grass growth, and it doesn't grow as high, so it allows more space for the smaller plants, and you get greater diversity and more wildflowers. A low fertile soil tends to be a much more flowery meadow. And you can see almost straight away by looking at meadows what kind of soil underpins it, just with a little bit of experience from the height that it's growing and the kind of species that you get there. So another key factor that determines the type of meadow is how sunny and how shady it is. And quite commonly you get both on the same area, particularly on verges where they have a hedge at the back. So you'll get plants growing at the front which like the sun, and as you get nearer to the hedge you get species that thrive in the semi-shade, such as the ones I've highlighted down below. So red campion, wood avens in the middle there, and angelica, which is more of a woodland plant but will grow quite happily in that kind of shady interface between the meadow and the hedge. And this isn't a bad thing at all, because actually when you get a kind of a grassy meadow that looks like this with a hedge behind, you actually got three habitats. You've got the meadow, you've got the hedge, which is a kind of linear woodland, and then you've got this woodland edge, the shady border in between. And you'll get different species of animals in each of those three habitats that favor the different plants that you find there. So how wet the meadow is another key factor. And again, you can often see at first glance really how wet the underlying soil is from the species that are there. So if you see any of these, then you can conclude that there's a lot of moisture in the area, probably permanent moisture, not just that it's rained recently. So ragged robin on the left looks a little bit like red campion, but much more longer, thinner petals, a very attractive plant. Cuckoo flower in the middle there, sometimes called lady's smock. And then meadowsweet, particularly on the right. Meadowsweet especially will also grow on the edges of waterways. So you'll find it on the edges of ponds, on the canals and lakes and the like, but it will grow into meadows too. And then finally, another key influence on the species composition is the acidity of the soil. Now, most of the soils we get in Leicestershire are neutral soils. In some areas, particularly up in the Charnwood area, such as Bradgate Park, it's much more acid soil, and so you get a different array of species up there. So the ones that you would expect to see on acid soil are things like devil's bit scabious, harebell, and sheep sorrel, which is you may be familiar with common sorrel, which you'll find on neutral soil, but sheep sorrel is the kind of acid equivalent. It's a much smaller plant, and the wings on the base of the leaves, as you can see in that picture there, much longer and thinner. Conversely, if we look at calcareous, kind of chalky soil, unfortunately, we don't have too much of this in Leicestershire, just little patches, a little bit more if you go into Rutland, but not too much of it. So plants like agrimony, wild carrot, wild marjoram will tell you if they're permanently growing there that it's got a chalky base to it. It's easy to get confused, however, because many of these plants are put into wildflower seed mixes. And it's not that they won't grow on neutral soil. They will for a while, but they may not last too long. So I actually see an awful lot of wild carrot around at the moment. Along the A6 on the verges there, it's absolutely everywhere. So I'm pretty sure it's been seeded. And it's growing reasonably happy there for now. It might survive for a few years, but it probably won't survive in the long term because the soil, underlying soil, is not chalky enough for it. So with all of these kind of factors, with a little bit of experience and a little bit of kind of detective work in identifying the species, you get a strong idea of the kind of meadow that you've got. So let's have a look at how you might go about creating a wildflower meadow. Unfortunately, we've lost 97% or so in the last 100 years of the kind of wildflower meadows that were quite common across the country. So many of the meadows that we see today have been created. So if you want to do that, I'm just not going to spend very long on this, but I'll just give you a few pointers. How would you go about it? Well, the easiest way is to just simply enhance what you've got. And this might be an option if you're thinking of letting your lawn grow. Just literally let it grow, stop mowing between April and August, and then cut it and rake everything that is there. And by raking it away, you are removing some of the nutrients. And if you rake it vigorously, it then creates space for other plants to seed into. Whether you want to add seed, that's a further option. The alternative to that, I suppose, is to basically dig up what you've got. But that's a lot of work. If you want to do that, you can kind of remove the topsoil. The topsoil is where all the nutrients are. So if you can get down to the subsoil, then you're likely in the longer term to get a more diverse meadow. But it can take a few years for it to settle down. So if you're going to get wildflower seed, make sure you get it from a reputable source. A couple of suppliers that I think are reasonably okay, Emmersgate and Naturescape. You want to make sure they're native species, native to the UK, that is, and ideally are sourced in the UK. You do get an awful lot of agricultural varieties thrown into wildflower seed mixes. And go for a kind of grass and wildflower mix. I mentioned earlier that a good meadow should be more grass than wildflowers. And aim to sow it in autumn, particularly if you put yellow rattle in, because yellow rattle needs to be sown in autumn. And I'll just mention yellow rattle again in a minute, just to point out what that is, because it's a really useful plant for creating meadows. So then we come on to management. This applies whether you've just enhanced your existing grassland or whether you started again. So initially, particularly if you set seed, allow it to grow for ideally 6 months or so, or the first season, and cut it about 3 centimeters. So don't shave it right to the ground. And what this does, it tries to keep the grasses in check and stops the grasses which grow faster than the wildflowers. It stops them dominating and taking over, and it gives the wildflowers a chance to not only germinate but to get established and grow, so to the point where they can stand on their own feet. And then thereafter, you leave it April to August, get into the habit of cutting annually. In September, rake and remove the cuttings. It's crucial to remove the cuttings because that stops, well, two things really. It stops the dead vegetation forming a thatch, which prevents germination of other species, but it also then prevents it rotting down and adding more nutrients to the soil. And even if you start off with a fairly high nutrient soil, if you do that over several years, it will reduce the nutrient level and ultimately help create a more diverse wildflower meadow. And just to, as encouragement really, if you're thinking of giving it a go in your garden, try it. It doesn't have to be a large meadow. Even just 1 or 2 square meters can be really effective, and it doesn't cost very much. So let's look at some of the species that we're likely to see in a good wildflower meadow. We'll come to grasses in a minute, but the top 3 are also kind of staples in wildflower seeds. So even meadows that have been seeded, you tend to get these 3 species. So it's worth trying to kind of learn those. So black knapweed on the left, it's a member of the thistle and kind of dandelion family, the Compositae, where it has flower heads that are made up of multiple condensed flowers. It's really good for wildlife because it's absolutely packed full of nectar. It's sometimes called hardheads because these the capsules below the petals will last all through the winter, and they are quite hard. You can actually get interesting galls and things formed inside them. Another was I'm just pausing because I just got a message that Zoom had crashed on me, so it's all started again. So hopefully you're still there and you can see what I'm showing and saying. So yes, I was just mentioning that the lady's bedstraw is related to kind of cleavers or goosegrass, but it's not prickly in any way, and it's the only one in the family that has yellow flowers. And then just also to kind of point out some of the buttercups. Buttercups are kind of really closely associated with meadows, aren't they? And there are 3 buttercups that you're likely to come across in most meadows. Creeping buttercup is the most common, and indeed it's the one you'd probably get in your garden. It likes damper soil, but isn't exclusively restricted to damp soil. But it tends to grow anywhere. The other 2 are much more significant. If you find those in a meadow, then they're good indicators that it's a longer established, more quality grassland mix. So meadow buttercup has a single leaf as opposed to the 3 leaflets that you get on a creeping buttercup. This kind of star-shaped leaf that's deeply divided. And it has similar flowers to the creeping buttercup, so it's the leaf that's the difference. Bulbous buttercup has leaves in between.
Sorry to interrupt, Dave. I think we've lost the screen sharing.
Right, okay.
So sorry.
No, thanks for telling me. I'll stop sharing. Just give me a minute. I'm just trying to get the screen sharing back up. It's not giving me the option to share my screen.
Is it still saying that you're the host?
I haven't got, I can't bring up the main Zoom screen. Oh, there we go. Let me just. Right, I think I'm back in.
Oh, yep. Oh, I can see that. I hope everyone else can. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully you're okay. Now everybody can see it. I'm not quite sure where you lost me. Hopefully when I was just talking about the buttercups. So I'll just move on fairly quickly, but just to come back to the bulbous buttercup, which is easy to identify because if you look under the flower, the bracts, these the kind of the parts of the plant that were forming the capsule around the bud of the flower, they point straight down, and you don't get that in any other buttercup. So that's fairly easy to identify. So just looking quickly at the grasses, these three is worth learning these because you'll see them on nearly every grassland, certainly unless you go to a nature reserve where it's high quality grassland. And these are three species that really thrive on nutrient rich soil. So false oak grass on the left particularly is a tall grass, will grow up to nearly 1.5 to 2 meters high. Cocksfoot is actually quite easy to identify. It has this, well, it's named because it looks vaguely like the foot of a cock. If you can use a lot of imagination, but even when it's dry, like we're seeing at the moment, you can still recognize it because the flowers are in that similar shape. And then on the right, a little bit more subtle is Yorkshire fog. It's a lovely little grass when it's fresh out. It has this pinkish tint, and it doesn't grow quite so tall, but it grows in big mats, and it kind of takes over really, and it can kind of squeeze out other plants. So we'll probably see some of this on Saturday. Unfortunately, a lot of both the flowers and indeed the grasses have kind of finished flowering early because of the drought. But you can still recognize quite a lot of them. They're still there. They're just not at their best. So to contrast with those grasses that tend to dominate, bullies, if you like, we've got the kind of the more valuable meadow grasses that are not so domineering, and they allow other wildflowers to grow alongside them. So if you find any of these three, then again, it's a bit like some of the flowers I mentioned. They're good indicators of you've got quality grassland, particularly these fine grasses that look very feathery. And that's because if you look at the end of each of the little side branches, they've got a single flower, as opposed to the one on the left, where there's multiple flowers at the end of each branch. It's a little subtle, and I won't go into it. There's an earlier video on grass identification if you want to learn more, which you can have a look at in your own time. So let's look at some of the wildlife species now. So let's start with those that are probably the most obvious ones because they're the ones that land on the flowers. Excuse me, the pollinators. A lot of people think, oh, well, it's just bees and butterflies, but in fact, it's a whole array of different insects, as you can see there. So we'll just have a quick look at some of them. So we'll start with butterflies. These are the ones that catch your eye. I suppose they're large and colourful. Small tortoiseshell is around at the moment, one of our, in my view, most attractive butterflies. Not particularly only associated with grassland, but will go wherever there is nectar to be had. And the others that I'm going to look at now are much more closely associated with grassland, particularly the skippers. And if you're not familiar with your butterflies, you may not even recognize them as butterflies. They look a little bit like moths. They're quite small, and you can see how they hold their wings folded, not spread out in a typical butterfly pattern. And both of them are fairly common. The bright orangey color is easy to see. The large skipper has these black markings on the wings. The small skipper has plainer orange wings. It could be confused with the Essex skipper, and I won't go into that just at the moment, but it's worth just bearing in mind if you see a small skipper, look up Essex skipper just to make sure it's different. And then I'll bring both of these up because they can look quite similar. Both of them are quite common around at the moment on grassland. The meadow brown is the typical meadow butterfly, hence its name. The males and females are a little different. The males on the right tend to be darker brown. The gatekeeper, on the other hand, on the right hand side here, they are much more orangey overall, and you see the orange is on both the upper wings and the lower wings, and whereas the meadow brown only has the orange patch in the upper wings. So hopefully we'll see those on Saturday, but if you go out and about, you should see them yourselves. We'll have a quick look at the whites because they're also very common at the moment. Try not to call them cabbage whites. It's a bit like, shouldn't use the word seagull. It doesn't really exist as a single species. So these are the three white butterflies that you are all out and about at the moment. They can be quite difficult to identify, particularly in flight, especially the small white and the green-veined white. But they're easily told apart once they land if you get a view of the underside of the wings. The green-veined white, as the name suggests, has this lovely kind of darker veining on the wings, which is normally quite obvious if you get a reasonable view. The large white, as you'd expect, is larger overall, but the key thing to look for with the large white is the black tips of the wings. It almost forms like an equilateral triangle. The black on the leading edge goes almost as far forward as on the hind edge of the wing. Compare that with the small white, where the triangle is much more pushed along the leading edge. So once you kind of get your eye in for that, it's quite a good feature. So it's not just butterflies that are visiting flowers. There are quite a few moths. Moths are not just nocturnal flyers. There's quite a number of moths that will be active during the day. This one you will see very commonly in the next month or two on you see it's caterpillars anyway, commonly on ragwort, common ragwort. The caterpillars with this kind of orangey yellow and black stripes, which are warning colors, because it collects the toxins from the ragwort and it builds up in its skin. So anything that eats it will get poisoned, basically. So to save its skin, it advertises the fact that it's not good to eat. And those same toxins get passed on to the adult moth when it eventually pupates and transforms itself into the adult. Hence, the adult moth has also got bright warning colors. So you see it's got the red underwing, but this red bar along there. Compare that to the two other kind of red and black moths that you'll see commonly on meadows, the 6-spot and the narrow-bordered 5-spot. On the upper wings.
David, sorry, I think you might be muted. I can't hear you. I can see your lips moving, but I can't hear you. Yeah, now, yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, good. Sorry about this, having a lot of technical problems. So yes, just I was just pointing out the hoverflies and particularly this one in the middle, the Batman hoverfly. So called, you can just work it out. The kind of Batman icon on its back. Sometimes it's clearer in some specimens than others. And on the right, the tapered dronefly isn't so much a wasp mimic, but in this case it's a bee mimic, and in particularly the male honeybee, the drone, is quite a good mimic for it. So they all mimic insects that can sting, but they're completely harmless in their own right. So they're cheating, really, trying to pretend that they are more dangerous than they are. And a couple of other flies, just to point out, the one on the left is also very common on flowers. It's one of the soldier flies, so called because of these bright metallic colors. This one's the broad centurion. The male is green and the female is blue, as you can see there. Very pretty little flies. Actually, and a couple more, but particularly the one there in the middle, Eriothrix, is really common at the moment. Almost every flower you look at will have one on. Look for these kind of red saddles on the edge of its abdomen. The other one, Tachinifera, is huge. It's the size of a small bumblebee, really. And these are interesting because they're both in a family called the Tachinidae, which is a group of flies that are all parasitic on caterpillars. They lay their eggs normally on live caterpillars. It's a bit gruesome. The eggs hatch out and eat the caterpillar. Eventually the caterpillar dies, but not immediately. So a few beetles to look out for. The common red soldier beetle is one of the commonest ones you'll see, bright red with the kind of black tip. This one I think is a great name, the swollen thigh beetle. The males have the enlarged hind femora on the legs. The females don't, but they both have this kind of green metallic color. And then there's lots of ladybirds to look at, but these are the commonest ones you're most likely to come across. The seven spot, the classic red with black spots one, quite a large one. Just has the one form, can't mistake it really for anything else. The two spot is much smaller, it's only half the size, so it's often its size that make it harder to see, but also the numbers have crashed thanks to predation from the harlequin ladybird over on the right. But another one that people don't often realize is a ladybird is the one in the middle, the 14 spot, because it's yellow and black. It doesn't really have spots as such, it has more of this checkerboard patterning, but it's very common, not necessarily on the flowers themselves, but on the leaves, on the vegetation. And in fact, that's true really for all of the ladybirds, because they don't eat nectar. They are feeding on aphids, and the aphids are largely on the stems and on the leaves. So the harlequin on the right is probably more common on bushes, but will happily visit flowers in the meadows, and comes in a multitude of forms, but it's one of our largest ladybirds. And they all have these big white blobs on the pronotum, the front bit of the body here. And the larvae, which are equally common, have these kind of orange go faster stripes down the edge, which none of the other ladybird larvae do. So let's look at the bees. These three are all very common at the moment. The honeybee can look a little bit like some of the solitary bees, but it usually has these orange segments at the front of the abdomen here, but it's quite variable, so not always. So if you see the orange at the front, and then the kind of black stripes further back. It's almost certainly a honeybee. And then a couple of bumblebees to look out for. Two of our commonest ones. The Carder bumblebee has this kind of bright orange and kind of foxy thorax, very furry, and then on its abdomen these kind of orangey and black stripes, because the hairs don't cover the entire abdomen, just at the edges. What happens with a lot of bumblebees is as they age, the hairs get worn off, and so they become a little bit harder to identify. But there's new recruits coming from the colony all the time, so as fast as the older ones die off, new ones will replace them. And then the other one, which is fairly easy to identify, the one on the right, the red-tailed bumblebee, the females and the workers, or the queens and the workers, look just like this, all black, with a reddy orange really tail. The males, which are also fairly common, also have a yellow band over the front of the abdomen there. Of course, the majority of bees are neither honeybees nor bumblebees. They are what we call solitary bees. And there's over 200 species of those. So there's lots and lots of those around at the moment, but many of them are quite small. They're all quite hard to identify. So I won't go into them, but I'll just flag up the wasps, which are closely related to the bees. In fact, bees really just vegetarian wasps. They evolved from the wasps. And the way to identify wasps is you have to look them in the eye, or more specifically, look them in the face and look for the pattern on the front of the face. So the common wasp has this anchor shape, black mark here, and the German wasp, which is equally common really, has this kind of black bar with the two dots. There are other social wasps around, but they're the two you're most likely to see. So all of the ones that are on the screen at the moment live in colonies. They are the minority of the bees and wasps. The majority live just on their own. That's why they're called solitary bees or solitary wasps. But these are some of the more numerous and easier to identify species. So a quick look at some of the bugs. So at this point, we're moving away from the flowers now and moving more into the leaves, into the vegetation, particularly at a slightly lower level. Many of these bugs will like to sunbathe. So if it's sunny and it's still and they don't see you coming, they will come out and sunbathe. And if they see your shadow or you get too close, they will scuttle underneath the leaf and just hide away and then perhaps pop out again a few minutes later. So the thing with bugs, although it's a term that is used to describe kind of insects or creepy crawlers, if you like, there is a specific insect order called the true bugs, if you like, and they're characterized by insects that have a mouth part, a sucking mouth part, a bit like a hypodermic syringe, and they push that into vegetation and they will suck out the sap, which is why they're not on the flowers, they're on the leaves and the stems. There's a few that are predatory, and they push that needle mouth part into other insects, but the majority feed on sap. And a couple of larger ones that you may see, the green shield bug, you can find anywhere, bushes, in woodlands, in your garden, but equally well on meadows. The shield bugs get their name from the outline, looks like I suppose a medieval shield. There are lots of different shield bugs, but the green shield bug is one of the easiest to identify, just plain green. Although it does go a straw brown color in the winter. And the other one that gets increasingly common from now on is the dock bug. It's related to the shield bugs, a slightly different group. And as the name suggests, it feeds exclusively on docks. And it will often sunbathe on dock leaves. So if you ever see a dock, have a good hunt, and you might see this. They're quite large looking insects. And a couple of different types of bugs. These also suck the sap out of the plant. If you ever see this red and black one, it's completely unmistakable. There's nothing like it. Often you can see them from quite a long way away because of the colouring. Undoubtedly, it's got toxins in it, hence the colour. And the other one that you're probably very familiar with, even if you don't actually know the animal itself, is you'll have seen cuckoo spit, this frothy white stuff that you get on the stems of plants. And so this is formed by the larva of the common froghopper, which looks a little bit like the red and black one, but it's just brown. It's quite variable, so it comes in all manner of shades of brown, but it's quite small. But the larva that forms the cuckoo spit pushes its mouth part into the stem, and it sucks out the sap, and it sucks out more than it needs, and it pushes out the remaining, or the surplus sap, out of its back end, and it effectively blows bubbles out of its back end. So that's what forms the cuckoo spit, and it does two good jobs. One is it's great camouflage. You know, birds and other insects often just leave them alone because it's quite sticky. I mean, it's basically sugar fluid is the sap, so you know it's quite sticky. If you stick your bill in there, or if you're a smaller insect trying to plow your way through it, you would get all gummed up. But also, it's a great medium for keeping the larva moist. Stops it drying out, and it allows it to live not just at the base of the plant, but higher up, even when the sun is shining. And a bit like the bugs, the grasshoppers are plant eaters. They're not feeding on the nectar. They will often feed on the grasses quite low down. These are the commonest ones, particularly the three at the top. In fact, the one on the left, the lesser marsh, is probably now the commonest grasshopper in Leicestershire. The field grasshopper on the right is one that you find on drier ground typically. The one on the bottom right, the Rose's bush cricket, is not a grasshopper. It's a cricket, and you can distinguish it from the length of its antennae. Look at all the other grasshoppers; the antennae are quite short. Crickets have got really long antennae that are as long, if not longer, than the body. But this one, the Rose's, is a fairly recent introduction to Leicestershire, or addition, shall I say. It's moved up from the south. Easy to identify because it's large, but it has these yellow bases to the pronotal sides here. There's nothing else that has that. Often it looks like a little mouse. It tends not to jump. It crawls around the base of the vegetation. So sometimes you can, oh, what's that? What's that moving through the vegetation? And if you're quick, you can find this. And so I'll just finish with a few of the other invertebrates that you'll find in meadows. You think snails particularly would certainly hide away, and many of them do at the base, but this one has managed to work out how to survive higher up the stems. And you will often find it, even on hot days, perched high up in the stems. The Kentish garden snail, it has this kind of mottledy brown colour. It's quite a large snail, and the way it survives is that it seals itself into its shell, using the mucus to form a skin over the mouth, and it stops it losing too much moisture. Harvestmen, really common at the moment. That's why they're called harvestmen, because they're most obvious at this time of year. So they're arachnids. They are related to spiders, but they have, unlike spiders, which have two abdominal segments, harvestmen just have one. The head, the thorax, and the abdomen are all fused into one. But they have 8 legs, just the same as a spider. In most cases, very long legs, so it allows them to maneuver their way through the vegetation. They look very spindly and vulnerable, but actually they're predators, and they use their long legs to lower themselves down onto their prey. And they're remarkably quick moving around. So this is one of the most common ones. The males and females are different. The males are this kind of reddy brown, just looks like a blob, really, just almost like a little tiny reddy brown pea. The females are more elongate, but have this kind of black patch on their body. This is one of the commonest spiders that you find in meadows. At this time of year, you may see the adults, you may see the young, but you more commonly will see the nest. It's called the nursery web spider because the female is one of the few invertebrates that looks after her young. And she builds these nests out of silk, which the eggs are laid in the center. The eggs hatch out to little spiderlings, and she'll hang around to protect them until the spiderlings are big enough to go their own way. And another one to look out for are the ants, and particularly at ground level, the yellow meadow ants. If you see a little pile of loose soil, it's worth just sticking your finger in and just disturbing it and seeing what happens. If it's a live ant nest and it's being formed by the yellow meadow ants, they will tend to come to the surface to explore and see who's disturbing their nest. And meadow ant nests are a sign of a long established meadow. They can take many, many years to build. And so if you see them, it's a good sign. You'll also see black ants higher up the vegetation, and they're feeding on the sap, the surplus sap that comes from the aphids. But the ones that you don't normally find yellow ants on the vegetation, they're down at ground level. So again, apologies for all the interruptions, but if anybody's got any questions, now's the time. Okay.
Dave, can you just go back to where you were talking about the 5 and 6 spot burnets, because that's the bit you cut out on.
Right. Okay.
Just that bit through to the hoverflies.
I will. So
20.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what you heard or what you didn't hear, but
About the cinnamon moth, and then we lost you at the 6 spot.
right. So I was just telling you the difference between the 6 spot and the 5 spot. They are equally common, these two species. So you have to look carefully at the spots. But as the name suggests, the 6 spot has 6 spots and the 5 spot has 5 spots. But you have to look closely to see the difference. And the difference is on the spots at the tip of the wing. So if you look on the 6 spot here, if you can see my cursor, it has 2 spots here, and the 5 spot just has the single one. Have you got that?
Yep. And then can you talk about the next 2?
Yeah, so the chimney sweeper is associated exclusively with pignut, which is a member of the umbellifer flowers, a bit like a mini cow parsley. It only grows about 30 centimeters high. It's typically found in old established meadows. If you've got pignut there, it's a good indicator that you've got a quality meadow, and you'll almost certainly have the chimney sweeper there as well. But if you haven't got the pignut, you won't have the chimney sweeper, I'm afraid. And then the Bonnet companion is the kind of classic moth. It's a large moth found in meadows. And it's looks a bit like a butterfly, really. It has quite colourful wings and these orangey underwings as well, which you can just see there. So when you first see it fly, you think it's a small butterfly. Did you want me just to mention quickly again the hoverflies?
Yes, please.
Okay, so the marmalade hoverfly, top left, is the commonest hoverfly we get. Easy to identify. It has these kind of black mustache stripes on the abdomen here. The Batman hoverfly is a larger, bulkier fly, and it's so named because of the kind of shadow on its thorax here that looks a bit like the Batman icon. Don't know if you can work that out. Imagine it shining up in the sky if you've watched your Batman movies. But it's one of those species that once you've seen it a few times, you will get to recognize it. It's quite large, it's colorful, and it loves to visit flowers, and it becomes quite numerous as the year goes on. In fact, late in the year, once it gets to September, when most, I suppose, meadow flowers have finished flowering, it moves on to ivy. So you'll see it on ivy flowers. And both of those are mimics of wasps, hence the yellow and black stripes. The dronefly, the tapered dronefly on the right, there's a few different droneflies, but this is a male, It's easy to identify because it has this tapered abdomen. So if you see that, you know, first of all, you've got a male, and it's definitely the tapered dragonfly. You know it's a male also because the eyes are touching. Female eyes, like you can see on the Batman hoverfly, are widely spaced. And this one's a mimic of male honeybees, the dragonfly. And then just...
That plugs the gap.
Is that it?
Yep.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now. So I thank you all for attending. We will publish a recording of tonight's talk. So if you want to revisit it, you'd be very welcome to do so. And the link will get published on Nature Spot. And I will also send it to the City Council. So if they've got your email addresses, they'll send it to you. So if you're coming out on Saturday, so we're meeting at 10 o'clock at Brox Hill, and hopefully we'll see a lot of this wildlife that we've spotted today. So I hope to see